Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Psychology of Business podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brandon Griffin, and joining me in my virtual studio is Dr. Sam Paustian-Underdahl. How are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you, Brandon?
I'm doing really good. Do you want to give a brief introduction of yourself? Who are you? What are you working on right now? And just what makes your research so cool that we're going to be talking about later?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you for having me. I look forward to our conversation. So I am really what I would say is a scientist practitioner. So I wear multiple hats. I like to do a lot of different things. And so I'm fortunate to have a career that allows me to explore a lot of different areas. So the one hat that I wear is my academic hat, where I'm a professor of management in the College of Business at Florida State University. I conduct research on gender and diversity in organizations, as well as the work family interface and employee well being and effectiveness, kind of more broadly. And so I also, in that academic role, I'm an associate editor for the Journal of Management, where I can help facilitate that review process of academic papers, helping them work their way towards publication in the Journal of Management. And then the other hat that I wear is on the practitioner side. So I'm a co-founder of Joyntly, and we are a human capital science and technology startup focusing on improving workplace soft skills through a SaaS-based behavior change platform. So a software as a service based platform to help employees and leaders improve their soft skills.
Awesome. So I'm sure when you were a little kid, you said that you wanted to be a business professor. Is that true?
Yeah, I'm not sure I knew what that was. I studied psychology as an undergrad because I've always just been fascinated in understanding what makes people tick, kind of human behavior. And actually started out pre-med, but quickly switched to psychology because that's what I was really interested in. And so I took one women's studies class as an elective when I was an undergrad. And that's where I first learned about different statistics showing, there's a gender pay gap and women are really underrepresented in senior leadership roles and things like that. And at the time, this was kind of mind blowing for me because I think as kids grow up, oftentimes girls are doing really good in school, in grade school. It was the girls winning the spelling bees and the girls, just really doing well academically. And so I had never really been exposed to this notion that, like, when women get out into the workplace, they're facing some challenges that often their male peers are not facing. So this was really new information to me as an undergraduate, and I thought it was completely fascinating. And so that kind of led me down this path of studying gender issues in the workplace.
So let's define it more broadly because I think, kind of like what you were saying, I think everyone has a general idea of what gender issues are in leadership. There's a pay gap. We hear things such as a glass ceiling. There's just a lot of things that we hear about gender and leadership, but it sounds like there's a problem out there, but people don't know exactly what's defined. So what is this problem? What is out there in the real world that's been explored in the literature as well?
Yeah, so this is a very complex issue, which is why it's so fun to study it because there are so many different things happening and so many explanations regarding why we tend to see these differences, gender differences in career outcomes and in career success and things like that. But so I'm glad you mentioned the glass ceiling because I think that term has been around for a while. I think it was coined in the late 1980s. And basically it's this metaphor suggesting that women are, climbing the career ladder and they're doing really well. And then all of a sudden they hit this invisible ceiling. And that at that point, kind of towards the top of the organization, that's where they're starting to struggle. And that's where these challenges are. And it's actually a very misleading metaphor. And so I think what I kind of tell my students is the new metaphor that I think is more accurate is called the leadership labyrinth. And so Alice Egley actually has a book about this. And she's done a lot of research in this area as well. So this leadership labyrinth idea is that it's not that women are doing really well up until they get to the top and then they hit the ceiling. It's really a maze all throughout women's careers. And research shows it's really, within a few years of graduating from college or from graduate school, that these differences are starting to show up. So it's twists and turns that happen all throughout one's career that women are often facing some challenges that their male colleagues are not facing. So it's not just when they make it to the top that there's this ceiling. It's really complex issues from day one, really, when they start their careers. And so I think that's a more accurate metaphor. One of the things I think underlying a lot of the challenges that we see are these implicit biases that pretty much everyone has. And sometimes my students are like, well, are women as biased as men are, when it comes to these gender role stereotypes? And research shows yes. I mean, we all grow up in the same kind of society with the same cultural norms and expectations. And so, yes, we all tend to have these biases. One of them that you've probably heard of is think manager, think male. So if you close your eyes and you're told to picture a senior leader, most people picture an older white guy. And so that's just one of these implicit associations that we all have. And so we tend to associate men with leadership roles more so than women. And so this association that we have can lead to a lot of challenges in how we view people around us. So what we remember from conversations, what we write in our recommendation letters, expectations that we have when men and women become parents in the workplace. So all of these things, these associations and biases can influence so much of our perceptions and our behaviors at work.
So is this something that's just always existed? Maybe if we zoom back 100,000 years, is this just something that's always existed, more of a patriarchal system where when I think of gender and leadership issues, I think of it stemming from maybe this idea of the nuclear family in, the middle of the 20th century, where the husband's going to be going to work, the wife's going to be staying at home, she's going to be raising children, just kind of this stereotypical idea of gender roles. Is this kind of where it comes from, the issues that we have today?
Yeah, yeah. So you're right on the correct track there. So social role theory, which is one of the really widely relied upon theories when thinking about kind of gender role norms and expectations, basically suggests that it is because of these historical roles that men and women have held, where traditionally, going back decades, men were expected to be the breadwinner, and so men often were, thinking about the 50s and 60s and 70s even, we had more men in the workforce than we had women. We had more men in senior leadership roles. And because of that, we tend to form these kind of expectations of how people should behave based on the roles that they've held in society. And so historically, more women were caretakers than men. And so that's where this expectation that, women are more communal than men, meaning we kind of expect women to be more empathetic, more other oriented. And we tend to expect men, because of that historical breadwinner role, we tend to expect them to be more agentic. So that would be more independent, aggressive, assertive, competent. And those are also the kind of behaviors that we expect to see of leaders. So that's why there's this greater kind of congruence between our expectations of men and our expectations of leaders. But yes, you're right. So it comes from these historical roles that have often been gender divided, but are less so today than they were in the past, right? So today, 50% of the labor force in the United States is made up of women. Looking at manager and professional roles, it's more than 50% women. Um, and if you look at educational outcomes, and I'm sure you know about this as a professor, looking at our classrooms, more women are graduating with undergraduate degrees and graduate degrees in the United States than men. And so, things are changing, but it will take a long time for those implicit biases to change. So, you really have to have decades of kind of the opposite stereotype in order to reverse those expectations that we have.
And if we think about people are in the workforce for 40 plus years, the people who are just graduating today, more women than men are graduating, that's going to take decades before that goes into effect. So walk me through what happens if we have more women that are graduating with bachelor's degrees and graduate degrees. What do they face when they get into the actual workforce?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's a lot. There's a ton of research out there, so I'm just going to hit on a kind of a few examples for the sake of time. So one example that I think is really fascinating is this idea of the language that we use when describing men and women in recommendation letters and in performance feedback. So thinking about that annual performance review that most employees receive. Research has looked at both of these arenas and found that men tend to be described more using words like brilliant and great leaders, while women tend to be described with words like team oriented and empathetic. And you might say, well, maybe they're actually different, right? So if you think about performance reviews, maybe they're behaving differently. But even if you take a resume that's identical, the only difference is the name at the top is either Jennifer or John, and you ask someone to write a recommendation letter just based on the resume, the language used is quite different, even though that resume is exactly the same. The only thing that's different is the name. So we tend to use different language. And so you can then see, like, if you're looking at a performance review and men are more likely to be described as brilliant and as great leaders, the implications that that might have. It's harder then for women to have those leadership behaviors and get the recognition that they are also brilliant and a great leader, because we just tend to associate men more so with those behaviors. So you can kind of see the downstream consequences
Mhm.
of that. That's one example. Another example is that these biases can influence our hiring perceptions. And so, a famous example that I love to talk about with my MBA students is the United States orchestras. And so, back in the 1970s, only about 5% of the musicians in the top orchestras in the United States were women. So, 5%. And so they started doing blind auditions where the judges would sit behind a curtain and they could not see the musician who was auditioning for the orchestra. And they would even have women take off their high heels so that the judges couldn't hear the difference of a high heel and assume it was a woman walking across the stage. And so this step alone, so making people blind to what the person looked like, made it 50% more likely that women would make it to the final stage of auditions for the biggest orchestras in the United States.
Mhm.
And if you think about this, like, this is kind of mind blowing that when we see someone, it changes how we actually hear the music that they're playing. So literally the music sounds different to us if it's played from a man versus a woman. I think
Really?
that is really amazing and fascinating. And so, I mean, that's in the context of music, right? So a blind audition can be helpful to remove some of that bias. But in the workplace, a lot of companies now are having someone screen out the names at the top of the resume so that just the resume itself is reviewed without knowing the name of the person at the top of the resume. So that's kind of a simple thing that organizations can do to help remove that, the influence of that bias. The third thing I'll mention is the importance of family. And so I'm sure you've heard of the motherhood penalty, fatherhood premium. This idea that when people become parents, men are often expected to really lean into their careers, and women are expected to lean into their family responsibilities. And so these assumptions can obviously be harmful for women, especially women who want to stay in the workplace and are really career motivated. And so research by Padovic and colleagues in ASQ, Administrative Science Quarterly, shows that there's really not a gender difference in work-family conflict. But when women have that work family conflict, it hurts their careers more than it hurts men's careers. And so this was something that we actually looked at, my co-authors and I, a few years ago. We published a paper in the Journal of Applied Psychology looking at men and women expecting a baby. So during that pregnancy period, we looked at changes in their own career motivation. So do we see women leaning back compared to men? And then we also looked at changes in perceived career encouragement from the workplace. So, is your boss giving you interesting assignments? Are you being mentored? Things like that. throughout the pregnancy period. And we found that for both men and women, their career motivation went up. So both the expecting parents, whether they're a man or a woman, became more career motivated. And I will say this was a sample of pretty highly educated, college educated or more kind of white collar corporate types of employees. Now, when we looked at perceived career encouragement, as we expected, that went down for women and it went up for men. So, kind of supporting this idea that people in the workplace have this expectation that fathers are going to lean into their careers and women are going to lean back from their careers. Even though we didn't see that for career motivation, we saw that women experienced less career encouragement from their supervisor and from their colleagues. And so those women were actually likely to leave that company and go to a different company after maternity leave. And so this is really expensive for organizations because we know turnover can cost a lot of money. And those women weren't leaving the workforce. They were just going to a different company that was more family supportive. But that's kind of another example of how these biases play out when thinking about parents specifically.
So I'm a parent, and I've actually noticed this in my own personal life. I am lucky that I can go to work every day, and my wife stays home. But obviously, staying home with kids can be difficult. Going to work if you have kids can be difficult for both parties. But there will be days where I come home and I'll take the kids on a walk for an hour, and I've had people stop their cars and say, "Oh my goodness, you're such an amazing dad! Look at you!" And I'm like, I'm not the one who should be taking this credit. I've been at work all day. I'm not the person who's been, doing this credit. It's my wife who's,
Mhm.
had to sacrifice, staying at home. So I definitely think that's true. But I had a conversation with Susan Madsen a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about this from the lens of kind of a benevolent sexism, how it's not people who want to purposely damage, women at work, but it's saying, oh, you have a family at home, let me go ahead and I bet you don't want to come to this event late at night because you probably have a family. Well, that form of you trying to accommodate that working mother is actually going to damage her because she's not going to be able to go to that event. She's not going to be able to make the career connections that are there.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's wild. That's very interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, that's what I say. Never assume. You're right. You may have heard that when you assume, it makes an ass out of you and me. Um,
Yeah.
so that's what I tell my MBA students. Don't make these assumptions, right? Even if you feel like you're making a decision to try to help someone, just have a quick conversation with them. Find out what your employees want, what their preferences are, how you can support them, before you just try to make those assumptions on your own. So that's kind of the best thing that I think managers can do.
Yeah, I had a baseball coach tell me that phrase once, and it's never left me. But let's go ahead and let's turn to a recent article that you published in the Leadership Quarterly. So, Leadership Quarterly, it's titled "Gender and Evaluations of Leadership Behaviors: A Meta-Analytic Review of 50 Years of Research." Before we do that, what's a meta-analytic review?
Yeah, good question. So, a meta analysis is where you go into the literature and you find all of the research that is out there, published and even unpublished, on a certain relationship. So, in this case, we were looking at the relationship between leader gender. Um, Dichotomize the simplest way to measure it, which I know is not the most accurate way to measure gender, but especially when looking at 50 years of research, older studies especially just dichotomized gender. So that was kind of the way it was measured. But looking at that relationship between whether you're male or female as a leader, and 13 different aspects of leadership behaviors. So we have all the transformational dimensions of leadership, transactional leadership, ethical leadership, and a few others. So it was actually like 13 meta-analyses in one, but we took all of the research we could find on those relationships and we summarized it statistically to show, okay, overall, what is that relationship between gender and each of these 13 leadership behaviors? And then we looked at some moderators, was it different based on time or level of leadership?
So let's think back 50 years, 1970. That's when you started. How was the leadership landscape different 50 years ago?
Yeah, it's a good question. So thinking about these kind of agentic and communal expectations, we were expecting to see a stronger relationship between being female and more of the kind of feminine or communal aspects of leadership. Maybe that would be stronger in the older studies and perhaps weaker in the newer studies. On the flip side, that relationship between being a man and those more agentic leadership styles, we also thought maybe that association would be, weaker in the past, or I'm sorry, weaker now and stronger in the past. Because as you and I discussed, as more women are in the workplace and in leadership roles, we would expect those associations to weaken somewhat over time. We didn't actually find that, which was a little bit surprising. And so we kind of had two competing theories at play here. One was kind of what I just mentioned. So, based on social role theory, do we expect women to be seen as higher in those more communal aspects of leadership? Would we expect men to be seen as higher in the more agentic, kind of consistent with gender role expectations? The other theory that we also relied on is called double standards of competence. And that's the idea that because there are so few women who make it into leadership roles, especially at the top, the women who do make it into those roles are typically really competent. So they have overcome obstacles and challenges to make it to the top. So they must be just really, really good. And so we were able to categorize these 13 leadership behaviors according to effectiveness. How effective are these different leadership behaviors? To see if women are kind of seen as higher on the more effective behaviors because of this double standard of competence. Or are they seen as higher on the communal as opposed to the agentic? So we were able to kind of categorize the behaviors according to those two different theoretical frameworks, which was interesting.
And when you talk about communal agentic, let's break that down into plain terms. What's communal? What's agentic?
Yeah, so communal is being other oriented, being empathetic, really focused on cooperation and collaboration as opposed to being competitive. So agentic would be competitive, aggressive, assertive, things like that.
And what were some of the key findings of this? I know it's really 13 meta-analyses in one. Doing one meta-analysis is a big deal, but doing 13 all in one, combining it, 50 years of research, that's a massive undertaking. So congrats on this. Thanks for publishing this. It's kind of, we can all use your work now as a good review to start if we want to research this. But what were some of the most interesting findings from this project?
Yeah, so firstly, putting together those two different theories, the gender role expectations versus the double standards of competence. If you look across all of the findings, we tended to find more support for the idea that women are engaging in more effective leadership behaviors, regardless of whether those behaviors are communal or agentic. So actually, women were significantly higher than men on pretty much all of the leadership behaviors. So within the communal category, we have ethical behaviors, idealized influence, individualized consideration, intellectual stimulation, relational or consideration behaviors, and then democratic and participative. Women were higher than men on all of those. Within the agentic category, we had contingent reward, task oriented behaviors, initiating structure, management by exception, active, and then autocratic and directive behaviors. So women were higher than men on contingent reward and task oriented behaviors, which are the more effective agentic behaviors. We did not see a difference on the other two. So MBE, active, and autocratic, there was no gender difference there. We also had a few gender neutral behaviors. So that would be inspirational motivation and management by exception, passive. Both of the inspirational motivation, women were higher than men, and that is a more effective leadership style, to be inspirational with your followers. The only behavior out of all of these 13 behaviors that men were significantly higher than women on was management by exception passive, which is kind of a hands off leadership behavior. Where it's really just kind of letting your followers figure things out on their own. It's generally not a very effective leadership behavior. And so that was the only one where men were actually higher statistically than women. So this lends credit to the idea that this double standard of competence is really what we're seeing, that women are engaging in more of the effective behaviors, even those agentic effective behaviors, which is really fascinating when you think about the statistics that women really aren't making it to the top. They're underrepresented in senior leadership roles. 8 to 10% of the Fortune 500 CEOs are women. And yet, according to the 50 years of research, women are engaging in effective leadership behaviors. So I think it's really interesting.
So I want to talk a little bit about how the data was actually collected. So I have friends who are economists. I actually started out my PhD in strategy, but I switched over to the micro side. They want to be saying, okay, what does it mean to be effective? Is that from performance? Is that some objective measure? When you are saying women are more effective than men in these 12 out of 13 categories, what is that? Is that some objective measure, or is that me as an employee rating a subjective view of my leader? What is that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I do want to emphasize in this study, so we categorize the leadership behaviors according to effectiveness. That
Hmm.
was based on the categorization was based on other meta analyses that have been done
Hmm.
previously showing the relationship between each leadership behavior and leadership effectiveness outcomes. Those effectiveness outcomes could have been measured in a variety of ways. So it could have been followers' perceptions of how effective the leader was, so kind of a subjective evaluation, or objectively. So it could be lab experiments or other types of situations where the leader is objectively measured. So it could be like sales performance, which can be kind of objectively counted. It could be measures of the team outcomes, so team effectiveness, which could be measured in a variety of ways. So those prior meta-analyses looked at effectiveness in a variety of manners, subjectively and objectively, but we're able to link these different leadership behaviors with effectiveness. And so that's where we drew from for our
Hmm.
categorization. But I will mention briefly that in 2014, I published a different meta analysis that was on leader gender and leadership effectiveness. And in that study, we found that when looking at other perceptions of the leader, women were seen as more effective leaders than men. But in self ratings of effectiveness, men rated themselves higher than women.
Now that's really interesting. I haven't looked at that paper from 2014, but that's really interesting. So when you're doing a meta-analysis, it's kind of you're working with what you have. So maybe that wasn't part of the scope what you're looking at. So one thing I want to talk about now, from the results of this study, if you had to translate things into more of a practical application of this, if I am a manager and I'm reading this study, if I'm reading your work, what are some of the key takeaways I could have from this article?
Yeah, so I think one for organizations that are trying to level the playing field, so to speak, for men and women in their career success and in their pursuit of leadership roles, I think it's important for organizations to know that when we're looking at perceptions and evaluations of leaders' behaviors, women seem to be engaging in really effective leadership behaviors. And so I think that's good news, especially if companies are trying to, promote more women into underrepresented areas of leadership. So then it's really up to the organizations to figure out the best way to do that. And so, like I said, if you can remove the name from the resume, that could be helpful. Having your leaders become aware of these biases and assumptions that may be affecting their decision making and how they're how they're evaluating men and women when it comes to promotability. And so oftentimes I think there's a common phrase that men are promoted based on potential and women are promoted based on performance. And so the idea there is that men are kind of given the benefit of the doubt, like, oh, they might not, meet all the qualifications, but I think he'll be, my gut's telling me he's going to do a good job in this leadership role. Whereas for women, they really have to prove themselves, and really perform highly before they're promoted. And so I think that's something for organizations to be aware of. And organizations can track metrics on this. So you can track, and there's lots of companies doing a great job of this. Mark Binoff is doing this with his company. But actually looking at metrics of who's in the pool of people that we could consider. Do we see differences in their performance evaluations? Are men being promoted more quickly than women? You can look at time to promotion, developmental opportunities, who's being given those assignments that are really important in order to be promoted, and things like that. So really paying attention to your metrics would be important. But I think for all leaders, thinking about leaders themselves who want to, succeed in their careers and be promoted, everyone can improve their leadership behaviors and their leadership styles. And so I think it's important for leaders to adopt. There's a variety of behaviors that can allow them to be more effective. And so understanding that the behaviors needed to succeed might vary depending on the person you're working with, the team that you're on, the type of organization, even the type of project. And so having a toolkit as a leader that allows you to have the different soft skills to be effective across those different situations is really important. And so I recommend for leaders and aspiring leaders to really invest in their leadership development. And there's a lot of different leadership development programs out there, but there are a lot of shortcomings with those, as I mentioned to you before.
And I think that's something good we can talk about next. So you talked about Joyntly a little bit at the beginning, but when I think about leadership development, when I think of people, who want to be better leaders, they tell me what's the best leadership style. Or online, I see, what are the 5 best things I can do, and they're definitely leadership styles that are most popular right now. Servant leadership's very hot. That's what I did my dissertation on.
Mhm.
But with Joyntly, you are taking a different approach. Is that right? What's your general approach with your company? How are you working on this? How are you solving the problem? How are you taking this wealth of knowledge that you have and translating it into real world applicability?
Yeah. So my co-founder and I started Jointly a couple of years ago because we did recognize some shortcomings with traditional leadership development. Usually it's one size fits all. So a company will send its leaders to a workshop or a seminar, and everyone's getting the same content, but we know that everyone has unique strengths and unique growth opportunities. So what we really need is more personalized development. Also, traditional leadership development tends to wear off fairly quickly. So leaders might take one or two nuggets of information from a workshop or a seminar, but for the most part, after a few days and a few weeks go by, people are reverting back to their habits. And so our focus with Joyntly is we've created a platform that helps individuals and leaders improve their soft skills by building habits around those behaviors that will allow them to be more effective. So we rely on kind of the latest and greatest behavior change science that exists to show basically micro lessons that leaders can have, where they practice effective behaviors, whether that's around leadership behaviors, coaching and developing others, or improving peer relationships, which we know is really important, those team oriented behaviors. How do we manage team dynamics? So we chunk our learning around different skills, different leadership skills, teamwork skills, and the leaders take an assessment based on the big 5, which is kind of the gold standard for personality. We focus our assessment on workplace behaviors. So it's not just personality in general, but really how do you behave at work? Based on that assessment, we have algorithms that determine people's strengths and growth opportunities for each skill of focus. And then 6 weeks at a time, they focus on a specific skill. We deliver exercises to them each week, and they choose which behavior they want to practice that week. It's something that they can do on the job related to the specific skill of focus, and it ties back to their growth opportunities. And so the idea is that they are forming habits that will be long lasting, using a really personalized intervention where we've highlighted their unique growth opportunities related to that soft skill. And we're kind of taking the guesswork out of it by giving them those behaviors that they should be practicing on the job to help them improve as a leader.
And I think that's really good because people are going to be at different positions, in their own personal development. But are they working towards one overall good leader construct, or are there different things people can work towards? Because obviously, let's say let's just take the big five. There are different dimensions where people can be based on. But is everyone working and taking these different paths towards one general leadership objective, or what's kind of the end goal when someone's gone through your program?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So, our platform is structured on a subscription basis. And so the idea is that you could be doing this for a year or multiple years. Each 6 weeks, you choose a specific skill of focus. So, we have a library of 20 skills right now, and it's always growing, but different team oriented behaviors, leadership oriented behaviors, growth oriented behaviors. So thinking about how can you develop a growth mindset, how can you be resilient and cope with stress more effectively, things like that. And then performance oriented behaviors. And so the learner or their organization can choose the soft skills that they want to focus on each 6 weeks. And that's what you're practicing. So your growth opportunities are based on that assessment, but they change for each soft skill. And that's because we have algorithms that kind of map what are those subdimensions most relevant for different skills. And so that's how each 6 weeks you're going to be focusing on different behaviors for each of those skills. And so you can revisit if maybe you focus 6 weeks on building peer relationships, and you felt like you started to learn those habits, but then you switch to something else and you want to go back. You can go back and practice that skill again. But the idea is that the more you practice these behaviors, you're going to form habits, and so ideally you're changing your long-term leadership behaviors.
And ultimately have you may be too early in the startup process to have experience, but in general, when you improve the individual characteristics of people, are organizations seeing this in their bottom line? Is this actually translating into real world performance?
That's the goal. We are a little too early to have that data, but we are always looking to
Mm-hmm.
partner with large organizations, and we can offer a very good deal on our subscriptions in exchange for collecting a little extra data, like you just mentioned. So we would love to show that when learners have used Joyntly for a few months or maybe 6 months, we're seeing an actual impact on business outcomes. So thinking about turnover, team outcomes, leadership outcomes, all of those things, customer satisfaction, even depending on the type of organization, patient satisfaction if it's a healthcare organization. So anyone listening out there who is interested in leadership development for their employees at a discount and partnering with us for some research, we would love to collect some of that data and show real impact.
You hear that? Go to Joyntly. They'll help you with your bottom line, and you'll help them in return. So to close this interview, I just want to ask you a couple more broad questions, maybe get your professional opinion on some things. But we've been talking about gender roles in leadership, but do you think that men and women actually lead differently? Are there different styles? This may be hard, but do they actually lead differently? Is there any truth to the biases we have?
Well, I mean, I'm a data person, so I will rely on the data that we had across 50 years with the meta-analysis, which suggested, yes, women are engaging in. I'm going to pull up the table here just to make sure I get this correct, because we did have a lot of data here. So we found that women were engaging in more higher levels of ethical behaviors, idealized influence, individualized consideration. So these are aspects of transformational leadership, which we know is a more effective style of leadership, intellectual stimulation, relational behaviors, as well as democratic and participative behaviors. So on average, and again, this is across hundreds of thousands of leaders across the past 50 years, we do see that women are seen as engaging in more of these behaviors. Now, this is, to your point, pretty much all of the assessments included in these primary studies were subjective evaluations. So it could be self-report or other report. So maybe it's the subordinates of the leader who's evaluating them, or it could be the boss, or others in the organization evaluating them. But according to these data, we do see that women are engaging in higher levels of those behaviors, as well as contingent reward and task-oriented initiating structure behaviors. So the only gender difference where men are engaging in more is the passive style of leadership. And then we did have a few where we did not see a gender difference. So active management by exception, active autocratic leadership, which is generally not very effective, and laissez-faire leadership. So according to our data, yes, men and women are engaging or seem to be engaging in different leadership behaviors. I do think, and this is something Leadership Quarterly is really calling out, and I think this is really important for the future of our field of studying leadership, is that most of our assessments are subjective. So we need more research using objective measures of leadership behavior, and that could be done in a variety of ways, whether it's video recordings of leaders actually doing leadership behaviors, and then that's coded in some more objective way. Maybe there's a checklist of what are the exact behaviors, and then you literally check off how often the leader is doing those things. I mean, there's a number of ways this could be done, but we definitely need more research kind of tapping into them objectively engaging in different leadership behaviors.
All right, you did the last 50 years of research. What's the next 50 years going to look like? What are the issues that are being looked at right now?
Yeah, great question. So, there's a lot of experience sampling methodologies now. This is kind of the new wave of research methods that I'm seeing a lot of, which is where you do multiple surveys a day across 10 or 15 days in a row, to look at kind of within person changes over time. So, when you do this in the morning, how does it affect your behaviors or attitudes later in the day? So I think that's a really kind of a novel approach that we can learn a lot about leaders, because leaders do act differently day to day, and we have different interactions with people in the morning versus in the afternoon or the evening. I'm actually working with some colleagues on an ESM right now, looking at parents in the workplace, and when they are taking on household labor. So, thinking about planning for the family, doing family activities, grocery shopping, picking up kids, planning those things, all that goes into running a household. So that household labor, how does that translate in the workplace to coworker perceptions of them? Thinking about this motherhood penalty, fatherhood premium. To your point that you raised earlier, the fathers engaging in household labor are seen as better listeners at work, but for mothers, they don't get the benefit
Hmm.
of that. So I think women are just expected to be doing all this household stuff, and it doesn't really help their coworker perceptions. But when men are doing it, their coworkers see them as better listeners, which helps with perceptions of their performance. But this varies day to day, right? So we look at, when you're doing more household labor this day, how does it affect perceptions the next day? So it's within person, which is really, really interesting. So I think more research along those lines. There's also a lot of new directions now with virtual and hybrid working, and how that can relate to these kind of gender differences and career experiences, and things like that. So I expect to see and hope to see more related to that as well.
And I've noticed, I know I've kept you for a long time. I have one or two last questions before we end. But I've noticed the academic terminology has changed. It's not women in leadership, it's gender in leadership. Are there studies that are exploring gender, as you mentioned earlier, more broad than just a binary
Yeah.
two-point system?
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. That's a really great point. Yeah, so now, there's transgender people and there's non-binary and there's a lot of different dimensions of gender that we haven't historically examined. So I do expect to see a lot more research into those dimensions of gender. It's a smaller portion of the population. So from a practical standpoint, it can be harder to collect data from individuals from those different groups. But I do expect to see more of that and more on intersectionality. So I was recently at a dissertation meeting with a sociology professor talking about how gender actually means different things across race. And how there's different gender expectations for people from Asian backgrounds versus people from Black ethnicities, and it was fascinating. So I'd love to see more looking at that as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I want to end with one last question. You're someone who has attained a degree of professional success. You are a professor at a prestigious university. You work with a prestigious journal. You are an entrepreneur in the startup world. So, congrats on all of that. But if you had to give someone career advice, if they want to be successful in their job, as someone in your position, what advice do you have for someone?
Yeah, I think that you really want to choose a career that you are passionate about. And it's easier to do that in academia, I feel like, than in other areas of work. We're very lucky that we, as academics, can kind of choose to pursue work on topics that we are passionate about. But even if you're not in academia, I mean, people spend so much of their time doing their career and in their jobs and doing their work. I think it's really important that you choose an area of work that you are intrinsically interested in, because that's what's going to keep you going. A lot of my research also looks at kind of burnout and exhaustion and engagement. And you're going to burn out much more quickly if you're doing something every day that you don't actually enjoy or that you're not interested in. So I think that's kind of the most important thing, is to choose a career path that takes you to a place that you're actually interested in. And hopefully that will help you have sustained success and sustained well-being.
Wonderful. Well, Sam, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. This was fun.
It was fun. It's fun to talk about the things that we do all day. There's a lot of work that goes into academic research behind the scenes. You see one journal article, but you don't realize this took 5 years to get here, and
Took 10 years for this
10.
LQ.
Well, I guess you did your other one in 2014. When that one was published, were you like, let's start the next one, and then it just
Yes.
kept going?
Yes. Yeah. So the 2014 was from my dissertation. And immediately after that, we started this one, but it took us 10 years because it was just such a beast and so many studies.
All right, in 10 years, when you publish your next one, I'd love to have you back on.
Sounds good.
All right, everyone, thank you so much for watching. If you are interested in connecting with Sam, with Dr. Paustian-Underdahl, where can they find you?
Yeah, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so you could just find my LinkedIn page, and also through the Joyntly website. So that's JOYNTLY.com. And I'd love to talk with anyone who wants to hear more.
Wonderful. Everyone, thank you so much for watching. You have a great day and happy learning. We'll see you next time.